All right. Hello, fifth period. Happy Wednesday. Obviously, sorry I cannot be with you here in person, but I am off getting my COVID vaccine, so I am one day closer to actually, hopefully, being with you all in class at some point. So I feel like it's worth it. What we got going on today? You are watching this lecture and taking notes about the elements of modernity and the accompanying anxiety. So we're taking some chapter 24 notes. In terms of what is on your to-do list, art history message board is due tonight before 11:59 p.m. on Canvas. The chapter 24 discussion is taking place in our next class, which for you all is on Friday. Discussion prompts are up on Canvas and are available on the chapter 24 resource page on Canvas as well. The Chapter 24 outline or mind map or modified outline, whichever one you chose, that is due before the start of class on Friday. And then we are also taking our Chapter 24 vocab and reading quiz on Friday as well. So kind of lots going on in the next couple of days. So just make sure that you're keeping track of all of that. We are doing vocab quiz and discussion on the same day, which I know is kind of hectic, but it's just what we got to do to kind of stay on track at this point. So that is that. So let us jump right in. We know that chapter 24, I mean, by now, certainly you should have read the whole thing. You know that part of the title of the chapter is An Age of Modernity, Anxiety, and Imperialism. So I'm really going to go over some of the things that are at the beginning of the chapter, because I think these are the things that are most abstract and they're concepts that are more difficult to grasp for students. The stuff about imperialism, we've kind of already gone over, and the stuff about the breakdown of the Bismarckian system, the growing conflicts, stuff that's at the end of chapter 24, it's pretty easy to understand, I think. So I'm just going to talk about stuff that's at the beginning of the chapter. So I want to start by talking about modern scientific thought. So we have to kind of position ourselves in thinking, what did Europeans know up until this point, and why would something changing that shake them up? So many Europeans throughout the 18th and into the 19th century believed in the ideas that had been brought forth by the scientific revolution and by the Enlightenment. Everything in the world around them seemed to prove that sort of human understanding and scientific understanding was at its peak. I mean, in the late 1800s, you've got cars, you've got industrialization, you've got electricity, you've got the beginning of a really modern world. And so for Europeans, that felt like proof of okay, we've did it, we peaked. This is it, folks. People believed that they had gotten there through understanding and knowing hard facts. They believed facts could be absolute. They believed that what they understood was the truth and that there was only one version of that. And they believed that they could ascertain the truth through just using reason. And that was really an idea that had come forth, we saw from the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution as well, is that you could reason your way to the truth. And so this had created the absolute truth or absolute facts that Europeans were now sort of dependent on. Some of the things that they believed that they had a complete understanding of by this point, they thought they completely understood the universe. They thought that space and time were absolutes, meaning that they would always exist even if humans didn't exist to observe them. They believed that atoms, the smallest particle item that makes up all matter, they thought they were indivisible, meaning you couldn't break them apart into smaller pieces, and they believed them to be solid. And these are some of the ideas that they felt like they knew for sure. But then, of course, in the late 1800s, new knowledge is going to be revealed, and that's going to really shake people up. What we're going to see as a trend, not just through scientific thought, but through other things as well, is that modernity creates anxiety. New modern ideas create anxiety because they open up the door to show Europeans what they didn't know. It's one of those things, the more you know, the more you realize you don't know anything at all, right? So it's kind of like that, and that creates a lot of hesitation and uncertainty in European society. After the modern scientific thought develops in the late 1800s and early 1900s, people understand that there's a lot still unknown, that there's a lot that is uncertain, and that we have only an incomplete understanding, only a partial understanding of things like the universe. One of the things that they figure out is that particles or atoms have subatomic parts. They understand new ideas about the energy that matter puts out, that is going to be referred to as quanta. And they start understanding, sorry, my face is cutting off the bottom part, that space and time are relative to the viewer. So I want to talk about some of the things, or some of the people really, that changed those ideas. So the first one is Marie Curie. So Marie Curie is a scientist in this era, and she and her husband are one of the first people who discovered radioactivity. Now, Marie Curie and her husband were working with the element radium. And radium, as it decays, it starts to glow. And so that's a clear indicator that this element was changing over time. Something was happening to it because things don't just randomly start to glow. So she and her husband essentially figured out that the glowing element of radium was rays that were radiation rays that were coming off as the atom disintegrated. And so from there, they basically figured out, well, there are particles within the atom. There are smaller parts of an atom. An atom is not an indivisible solid piece. There's actually pieces within. So that's where they're figuring out like protons, electrons, all that kind of stuff. Um, as a sort of tangential story, but it's really, really interesting, I promise. During this age, radium used to be put into paint because it would glow. And in World War One, a lot of industries would use radium-based paint to create different things for the war, so that it could glow in the dark, essentially, especially things like clocks, like a pocket watch. If you were in the military in 1914, you need to be able to tell what time it is so that you can carry out, XYZ military maneuver. But you also don't have like a lot of flashlights, or you're not trying to be drawing a lot of attention to yourself. So you need to be able to see what time it is without having to bring a lot of light to it. And so radium based paints are super useful for that because they will kind of glow in the dark. So in the United States and in Britain both, they had large factories where mainly women were painting these tiny little clock faces with radium based paint. And because they were painting them, they needed to do very, very small brush strokes. And so, what they would do in order to get the tip of the brush to be a super fine point, they would lick it. So, they would put their paintbrush in the radium based paint, they would paint the little number on the clock face, and then they would lick the paintbrush and do the same process all over again. Now, what was happening to them is that they were exposing themselves thousands of times to radiation. And that we now know is really bad for you. That's why when you go to the dentist, that they put that giant weird vest thing on you. It's to protect your body from X-rays. Too much radiation exposure is not good for you. That's why after the United States dropped nuclear weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, so many people got sick from radiation poisoning. It causes things like cancers. So they didn't know that in 1914, unfortunately. So a lot of these young women who became known as the radium girls, they started developing terrible tumors in their jaw and in their chin. They started losing all their teeth. Many of them became very sick. Many of them died. Eventually, some of them actually sued their employers. It was one of the first successful lawsuits like that brought forth to an employer. And anyways, this is all tangential, but that's all to say, like, there's this other story connected to radium that is super interesting. They made a movie about it, and there's also a book written about it. So if that is a story that is interesting to you, check it out, Radium Girls. Anyways, back to this. So another person who takes ideas that are brought forward by Marie Curie and her husband is this guy, Max Planck, Planck. And he basically realizes that matter, or energy rather, is not radiated in a regular, consistent, steady stream, that matter is radiated irregularly, like in bursts, essentially. He called these bursts quanta. And this is where we get the idea about quantum theory, that matter is coming out in these like sporadic bursts. So you can already kind of get a sense of like, even that makes for anxiety, right? That it is not consistent, it is not predictable, that it's none of those things, and that would really add to people's anxiety about what they know in this era. And then, of course, from there, the one and only Albert Einstein is coming out of this era as well. He has a number of big ideas that are way beyond me, honestly. But one of them is his theory of relativity, the idea that space and time are not absolute, but they are relative to the viewer. They are not absolute truths. They are relative to the person viewing them. And from there, he came up with this idea of a four-dimensional space-time continuum, which sounds just as intense, or it is just as intense as it sounds. Einstein was not super famous at first when he was proposing these ideas. He gets a little bit famous later on. I'll tell you about that in a second. But the way Einstein explained all of this about relativity, in his own words, he told a reporter this in the, I think, early 1900s. He said, "It was formerly believed that if all material things disappeared out of the universe, space and time would be left, that they would be the absolutes. According to the relativity theory, however, time and space disappear together with the things. So this is like for people in the scientific community. For most regular Europeans, they have no clue what's going on. They don't know anything about this. They don't even know who he is. However, then a little bit later, he publishes his formula E equals mc squared. That's like his most famous formula, I guess, or maybe the most well known. And basically, this helps explain the energies within atoms because E equals mc squared explained that matter is another form of energy. So later on, it will be these ideas that will be used to create nuclear power and nuclear weapons. In fact, Albert Einstein in 1939 writes a letter to American President Franklin Roosevelt and says, "Look, we need to start developing nuclear weapons because the Germans in Nazi Germany are already starting to do it, and that's going to be bad." So he's actually one of the people who gets the ball rolling for nuclear weapon development in the United States. But like I said, he doesn't get tons of fame until 1919 with something called the Eddington experiment. Basically, during this experiment, the experiment was taking place at the time of a solar eclipse when the sun and the moon are like blocked one out by the other. And so what the scientists did ahead of time is they measured the position of the stars relative to the sun, and they called that the true position or the true accurate position. However, when the lunar eclipse happened, what they noticed is that the light from the stars didn't match up where it was supposed to be. The light from the stars had been deflected in the gravitational field of the sun. The light was bending around the sun during the eclipse because of the gravity. So this showed that Einstein's idea about relativity and about understanding like space, time, and matter was all correct. And so it's at this point that Einstein gets a lot more fame because his idea had been essentially proven true. Again, most people, like regular European people, probably wouldn't have known anything about this, but people in the scientific community were like, "Oh, okay." This is a headline from right after the Eddington experiment. "Lights all askew in the heavens. Men of science more or less agog." That means like shocked over results of eclipse observations. Einstein's theory triumphs. Stars not where they seemed or were calculated to be, but nobody need worry. Even from this like headline, you can kind of get the sense of anxiety, right? That people are shocked, that everything is askew, everything's messed up, things are not how they should be or how people thought they would be. Don't worry, things are going to be okay, right? You can sense that impending like freak out that's coming from this new understanding. So this really shows us that modern scientific ideas obviously opened up the door for modern scientific understanding, but they also created a lot of anxiety in that time period. Now I want to talk a little bit about philosophy and psychology. Um, for most of the 18th and early 19th century, when we think about philosophy and we think about psychology, psychology wasn't a huge field yet, but philosophy we know was. And for most of this time period, for philosophy, reason was the most important thing. It was reason that could help you get to the truth about human nature. It was reason that could help you understand why the societies work, or why we are the way that we are, or what the meaning of life is, or whatever. During this time period, the late 1800s and early 1900s, irrational ideas and the nonsensical are going to be explored by philosophers. And again, that will freak people out a little bit. One person who's really best associated with this era is a guy named Friedrich Nietzsche. If you click the link, if you go to the actual slides, not on this video, and click the link, it'll take you to an awesome, like 6.5 minute School of Philosophy video about him. And it does a great job of explaining Nietzsche's ideas. I will do my best, but his ideas, I will be honest, are very like, complex, and very like, I don't know, meta in some senses. So if you still feel confused after I explain it, please go watch the video. I promise it'll be better. So Nietzsche was somebody who believed that Western bourgeois society, so not the workers essentially, but the rest of the upper middle and upper classes, that Western society was sort of like bad. It had gone bad. He believed it could not really achieve any more real cultural creativity because there had been too much emphasis on or rationalism, and that had eroded people's ability to feel real emotions, to feel real passion, to go off their instincts. And one of the big things he blames for this is Christianity. He believed, in his words, that Christianity had created a slave morality. Basically, that because Christian morality has so many like do's and don'ts, these are sins, these are positive attributes, be humble, don't steal, that type of thing. He believed that that had really limited people. He believed that people, and again, in his own words, needed to recognize that God is dead and we have killed him. Again, he's very out there. He believed that people needed to act more on their true emotions and not be held back by these, slave morality mentality. And only then could they become what he calls an Ubermensch. It means like, it translates to Superman, but he means like somebody who's most actualized, who's their most selves. So it's a really interesting and different understanding of how we are the way that we are. Again, if this was like, what did she just talk about? Please go watch the video. I promise it's way better. Other people like Nietzsche, like picked up where he left off or took their own sort of versions of his ideas. One of them was Henri Bergson, who believed that rational scientific thought was useful, but did not lead to reality. He believed that you couldn't like really identify in a singular piece what was truth or what was reality, that reality was like this life force all around us. It suffused or infused everything, but you could not like pick it out. So like I said, this is all very like, ooh, meta. It's like, how do I know what is real type of thing. Anyways, Bergson believed that experience and intuition were far more important than rationalism or science to determine what reality is. Another guy named Georges Sorel also takes the ideas put forward by both Nietzsche and Henri Bergson and applies them to his love of revolutionary socialism. So we remember that there's two types of socialism. Socialism is obviously an economic system that is essentially the opposite of capitalism, where you do not have private property, you do not have private ownership, that you have more of like, we all work together and we all get some of the share mentality, at least. Anyways, but evolutionary socialism believes that you can get there evolutionarily, like along the way. You can evolve towards socialism, whereas revolutionary socialism, which is what George Sorel was a proponent of, means you have to overthrow the system. There has to be a revolution. It's going to be what happens in Russia eventually, which we'll talk about next chapter. But anyways, he believed that like, because rationalism has its limits, and we can assume that rationalism would be best paired with evolutionary socialism, it wasn't going to work. Violence sort of had to happen. Revolution had to happen in order to destroy capitalism. And he really believed that the first sign or the first indicator that this was going to take place was a general strike. This would be all workers across the country stop working. And he viewed this, I think he romanticized it a little, honestly, or a lot, as this like amazing, mythical, heroic moment where workers across the country would join up together and overthrow the system. I think that idea is really well expressed in this drawing here. The hand that will rule the world, one big union. So this idea is not unique to George Sorel because this is not a cartoon or a drawing created by him, but it is an idea that is becoming more prevalent during this era. Great. The next person I want to talk about is Sigmund Freud. Freud is the father of modern psychology, so understanding kind of why we behave the way we do and sort of our inner selves. And he pioneered a field that he called psychoanalysis. So Freud essentially believed that there were a lot of things that make us the way we are and determine our actions and things like that, but a lot of it was subconscious. Like we didn't even know that it was teaching us how to behave. And it was a lot of times buried deep within our brains or deep within ourselves. Certain memories or experiences that had been very unpleasant, Freud believed that our brain, or our subconscious rather, suppressed them or repressed them. He calls them repressed ideas. that it hid them away, that we could not consciously access them except in dreams or sometimes through hypnosis. And so, I mean, we've all had like maybe weird dreams where we're like, wow, what did that mean, right? Um, I'll tell you an example. I have sort of a recurring dream. It's not the same dream every time, but it's a recurring theme in my dreams that like I need to call. It's really important. I have to call 911 or I have to call like it's really important. I have to call and I can't get my phone to work. I can't like find the right phone number. I can't punch in the numbers right. I do it, but it's not loading. And that's a recurring element. Obviously, like that's connected to some kind of deep seated anxiety or fear or something that I have. I don't know where it comes from. That's something that is clearly like a repressed part of my subconscious that I don't know what the answer is. And I'm sure we all have things like that. I hope I'm not the only one, at least. Um, but Freud believed that all those things had a purpose and had a meaning. And he essentially believed that life was a battle between three components of ourselves: the id, the superego, and the ego. Essentially, the id is very like animalistic. This is a part of our selves that is what he called the pleasure principle. Basically, it's that animalistic thing that pushes us towards pleasure and away from pain. Um, so this is not anything related to you should do this or you shouldn't do this. It's just, I want this. Um, then there was the superego, which is pretty much the opposite of that. The superego is like the center of morality. These are all of the things that like inhibit us and hold us back. So I think probably the things that Nietzsche would have found very annoying, that hold us back to do the right thing. And both the superego and the id are opposite forces, and they're both working on the ego. And the ego is kind of what allows us to be operating in society. It's constantly balancing and compromising the needs of the id and the needs of the superego, to be a maintainable life. The ego was the seat of reason. So that's kind of where he was going with that. And again, it's a very sort of like abstract concept, but I think, if you start to think about experiences in your life where you've acted, outside of the rules or outside of the moralities to do something that best served you, that would be an action of the id. Whereas if you have been selfless, if you have, done something that didn't help you or even brought pain, emotional, physical, whatever, to you in order to do the right thing, that would be the actions of the superego. And you're constantly in battles of trying to like figure that out, right? It's kind of like, the id says to me today, oh, I'm tired, lay down on the couch and do nothing. And my superego says, no, Miss Sosa, get your butt out there, go work out, go do your like gym exercises. And I'm in a battle, right? So anyways, that's kind of the idea of the id, the superego, and the ego. Those ideas are still bounced around a lot by psychologists today, but some of the other Freud's ideas are like way out there that are not accepted anymore. He has weird ideas about the Oedipus complex, which is this idea that deep down, for a reason that we cannot control, men or boys, rather, when they are children, have a desire to either mimic their father or replace their father so that they can receive the attention of their mother. Um, it gets the name from the story of Oedipus, which is a Greek story. It's one of Homer's epic poems or stories, I guess. In the story, there's this main character, Oedipus, and he is the son of a king and queen, but he's given away at birth, and so he never knows his birth parents. And he becomes this great hero, like traveling over many lands. He eventually gets into a situation where he kills a king and marries the king's wife, and it turns out that that's his mom and dad. Like he killed his own dad and married his mom. Ooh. So anyway, that's where Freud gets his name, the Oedipus complex. There's a similar version for women called the Electra complex, where women desire their father's affections by either eliminating their mother or replicating their mother. It's kind of weird, kooky stuff. Anyways, that's all Freud stuff. A little tangential, but interesting, really interesting. Another person I want to talk about is Herbert Spencer. And he is somebody, among others, during this era that is pushing forward social Darwin theory. So we talked about this before when we talked about imperialism. Social Darwinism is Darwin's idea about survival of the fittest, but applied to human societies. So the societies that are the most fit are the ones that are going to survive. And so Herbert Spencer is one person who like sort of pushes this idea out there, but there are others as well. And Ideas about social Darwinism are also attempted to be applied to essentially like to different races. And this is an era where we see a lot of what they would call scientific racism. Essentially, in this era, you see a lot of people doing things like measuring skulls, measuring facial features, trying to prove or to show that one race was better than another. And by collecting this data, all these measurements and things like that, that was a way to like prove that one group was better than another. Of course, this is all just racism with some fancy wrapping on it, but people in this era felt like it was legitimate because it had these trappings of science on it. We also see during this era that it starts to, notes here in a second, it also is really influenced by the growing nationalism. So we know that in the mid 1800s and onward, nationalism is a strong force. And so ideas about one race or one society being better than another start to become really useful if you're trying to stir up nationalism in a certain place. One person who pushes this forward a lot is Houston Stewart Chamberlain, whose book is up there in the top corner. His idea is really centered around Volk-ish thought, Volk. Volk in German means people. And so the irony here is that Houston Stewart Chamberlain was not actually German. He was British and then became a German citizen and was like, oh, German people are the best people. German people, the Volk, they are descended from the pure Aryan race and they're way better than everybody else. And we need to make sure to protect pure Aryans and their culture from degradation by the lower cultures, especially people of color, Jewish people, etc. And if you're thinking to yourself, wow, this sounds really Hitlery, yes, this is where Hitler is picking up his ideas from these ideas of Volkish thought that really get their start because of social Darwinism during this era. Another thing I want to talk about quickly here is the eugenics movement, which is also sprung forward from social Darwinism. The eugenics movement has a goal to improve the genetic quality of human populations. And so in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and even into the mid 1900s, we saw different countries, different groups of people attempting to improve the genetic quality of a population by either encouraging the fit to reproduce or discouraging the unfit from reproducing. So people who are considered like genetically perfect for their race were encouraged to have lots of children. In fascist Italy and in Nazi Germany, women who had like more than 10 children were given these special medals and like given a ceremony. We'll talk more about that later on. Whereas women in those same countries, and actually even in the United States, who were not viewed as genetically superior, people who had chronic illnesses, people who were disabled physically or intellectually, people who had low IQs, even though IQ tests are not a real measure of intellect. People like that, people who were not of a like good race, oftentimes they were either discouraged from having children through things like anti-miscegenation laws. That is a law that prohibits race mixing. We had those in the United States actually into the 1950s. Basically, it meant that if you, for example, in California, if you were a white person, you could not legally get married to an Asian person in the 1940s, or you could not get married to an African American person. And this was to limit or discourage reproduction of these genetically inferior children, so mixed race children. So obviously, this is super racist. But it gets worse, unfortunately. In some places, including in the United States, including in Nazi Germany, people were actually prevented from having children through forced sterilization. So what that meant is that people were put into hospitals or into surgeries to literally physically prevent them from being able to have kids. So that could be through like a chemical castration process or a physical removal. For instance, women having a forced hysterectomy, that's when they remove the woman's uterus. And so this happened for African American people in the United States. It happened in Nazi Germany. It happened in other places as well, unfortunately, usually by the government. So really like sketchy, bad stuff. So that is also really a product of this era. Also, sort of a current events connection here. It's interesting when we think about that and we think about anti-miscegenation laws and forced sterilization and the eugenics movement were like, oh no, that's so bad. But it's really interesting because in the modern day, we have the scientific ability to manipulate the genome, right? We could, people who want to have a baby can get a scientist to play with the genes and make sure they get a boy or a girl, or whatever sex that they want. They can even manipulate it to have certain qualities like hair color and eye color, stuff like that. And so today there is kind of controversy around that. That has even been termed neo eugenics or consumer eugenics. So it becomes a really interesting moral issue about whether that is okay for parents to manipulate the genetics of their future children, or not. There's a lot of moral. I feel like we could get into a whole debate with that, but we will hold that for now. So anyways, the last thing I wanted to talk about with philosophy and psychology has to do with the church, actually. During the late 1800s and into the early 1900s, by that point, the church or organized churches like the Catholic Church had lost a lot of their power. Industrialization and urbanization had broken a lot of the community ties that people had to churches in rural areas. So that was one kind of issue. But also, as sort of liberalism had grown and ideas about separation of church and state had increased, churches weren't getting the same support and backing from the government that they used to get. In the French Republic, eventually they completely split the Catholic Church from the French government. So you really see a reduction in that traditional power structure. And so that also, or what we see coming from that, or connected to that in a lot of ways, is the anti-clericalism movement. So this is a movement away from having a clergy system that would either be a part of your government or perhaps even at all. You also have people like Ernst Renan, whose book is right here called The Life of Jesus. People who are starting to have criticisms of religion. I mean, it's European history. They're always going to have criticisms about religion. But Ernst Renan believed that everything in the Bible was good and well. It taught some good moral lessons. Obviously, Nietzsche would not agree, but the Bible taught great moral lessons. But he didn't think we should take it at face value. He did not believe that Jesus was like the Son of God who'd been creating miracles. He believed that Jesus was a historical figure, which he was, and we should view him as such. And we should take the lessons from the Bible, but we shouldn't take it at face value. Obviously, the Catholic Church was like, no, we don't like this idea. The Catholic Church under Pope Pius IX issues what he calls the syllabus of errors, basically saying like, look, the Catholic Church isn't condoning any of these ideas, and we don't have to go along with any of them. We don't have to go along with nationalism or socialism or liberalism or any of this newfangled stuff. So there's definitely a tension here between the modern ideas, I think, or some modernization of school of thought around religion and what the Catholic Church wants to believe. But again, that's not really a new trend. We've seen that happen in the scientific revolution as well. However, later on, we do see that the church is willing to make reform. Later on, Pope Leo the 13th was willing to make some allowances or changes in the Catholic Church's official behavior. In his book or essay or whatever, it's called De Rerum Novarum. Pope Leo the 13th allows the teaching of evolution to take place in Catholic schools, which is like big deal because that's saying that humans descended from apes as opposed to Adam and Eve. He allowed it to be taught as a theory, not as an absolute truth. And he also, in De Rerum Novarum, criticizes capitalism. So the church is really inserting itself sort of politically and economically. He said that capitalism did have a lot of downsides, and he said socialism had a lot of Christian-based principles, like caring for one another. However, he obviously says, if you want to be a socialist, great, be a Catholic socialist. Don't be a Marxist who disavows religion altogether. The bottom line is here that there is a lot of, again, change and questioning of traditional ideas and evolution of some things that have been, I think, really taken for granted for a long time in European history, and therefore that's going to lead to anxiety. All right, so the last thing I want to touch on here is about art. I'm not going to go into tons of detail about some of the visual arts because that's what you're doing in art history message board, so I don't want to spoil any surprises. I want to start by talking about literature. So in this era, we are going to see, in terms of literature, a category or a style that's called naturalism. And if you're thinking to yourself, wait a second, naturalism, last time we learned about realism, aren't those similar? Yeah, they are. Naturalism is going to be a continuation or an extension of realism, but naturalism in literature is not going to be as optimistic. Naturalist liter- Naturalist writers are often going to be very open and honest about the struggles that people have in life at this point in time. They will describe situations where, the main character is dealing with alcoholism or with poverty or with prostitution or whatever. But a lot of times they describe it as like, oh, the character is like trapped. It's either, it's forces beyond their control, kind of. And so in that regard, it is, I would say, quite pessimistic. I want to talk about a couple of writers during this era, one of them being Emile Zola. So Emile Zola's one of his most famous works is a series that's called the Rougon Macquart. It's like 20-book series, and it follows these three lines of the same family, essentially. And I know you can't see the rest of the text because I have this image over it. This is actually one of the family trees. So Emile Zola, when he's creating this 20-book series, he has this super detailed family tree where he has, clear understandings of how the characters are related to each other and how, who's born when. And this showed a real, level of commitment to detail that really showed that he is trying to be sort of as realistic in a lot of ways as possible. The story follows this woman who's like an upper class woman, but she has an intellectual disability. She gets married to another upper class man and they have children. So that's like one branch of the family on the family tree. But then, scandal, she's also having an affair with somebody else and she's having kids with him too. So then she has this like other side of the family. And it deals a lot with like the issues and like the historical context around them. Emile Zola did a ton of research and including dates of everything that was going on in the time period that the books are set in. They're set over a long span of time. So he had like all of these historical context features laid out and thought out to a T to understand how this family would have been impacted, how individuals would have been impacted by what was going on in France at this time period, and how it would shape them to be who they are. In addition to, there's a lot of descriptions of alcoholism and then the impacts also of the woman's disability and how it impacts her children. So that is one thing that he's well known for. Another thing that Emile Zola is well known for, though, is like not literature in the sense of storytelling at all, but another big important piece of writing that he does in the late 1800s that is just sort of called J'accuse, which means I accuse you in French. And this has to do with the Dreyfus Affair. And so I'm going to take us on a little side journey here to talk about anti-Semitism. So when we talked about the eugenics movement and like Volkish thought and stuff like that, obviously those things are very much connected to the growing anti-Semitism, which is discrimination, fear, or violence towards Jewish people. That's unfortunately prevalent during this time. We also know that anti-Semitism has a really long history in Europe. There have been numbers of times throughout European history where Jewish people have, been blamed or been scapegoated. I mean, think back to the plague, right? Anyways, in France, there was a Jewish French military person named Alfred Dreyfus. And in the late 1800s, he was accused of spying on French military actions and passing the secrets to the Germans. He was put on a very short, private trial within the military. So there was no public element to this trial. Very quickly, he was found guilty. He was going to be imprisoned and exiled. But first, he was basically humiliated as part of his punishment. He had to stand in front of this big crowd of other military members and the public behind him, and they literally ripped off all of the badges on his military uniform and cut them off. They took his sword and broke it. It was a very much public you're done type of thing. There was not a lot of clear evidence against him. And in fact, there was emerging that there was actually probably a better suspect, but he was a French Catholic, and they'd already accused this French Jewish guy of having done it. The French Catholic guy, the military basically whisked him away and like didn't make a big deal out of it. But a lot of people in society at this point in time recognize this Dreyfus affair for what it was. It was anti-Semitism at play, including Emile Zola. So Emile Zola writes an open letter to the French president and has it published in the front pages of the newspaper, J'accuse, where he basically says like, you messed up. You're doing this because of anti-Semitism. Like he criticizes the trial, he criticizes the lack of the jury, he criticizes the judicial errors, the lack of evidence. He eventually then gets like accused and found guilty or convicted of libel, which is when you're like printing lies essentially. He has to flee to England to avoid punishment. They do give Dreyfus a second trial. He's found guilty again, probably because they didn't want to be embarrassed. Later on, Dreyfus is exonerated and is shown not to be the actual culprit. But this showed, number one, how strong anti-Semitism was, but it also shows how, like, what kind of person Emile Zola was. So I think it's a really interesting, and it's a super famous like instance in modern history. Anyway, so that's Emile Zola. Let's talk about Russian literature. During the second half of the 1800s, this is like the golden age of Russian literature. There's a number of super famous Russian authors who would fit into this category or style of naturalism, including Dostoevsky and Tolstoy. Tolstoy writes this super long book called War and Peace. It's about the Russians' war with the French during the age of Napoleon. It's like, accurate down to the T type of thing, but it's a saga, right? But really interesting, or more interesting to me at least, is Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. This is the story of a man who decides that he's going to murder a pawnbroker. A pawnbroker is like kind of like somebody who sells goods. Like, for instance, if you need money and you have something valuable like gold earrings or whatever, you could take them to the pawnbroker and you could pawn them. You would sell them to the pawnbroker, they would give you money, and then they would turn around and sell the earrings again. Anyways, the pawnbroker in Dostoevsky's story is not like a good person. So the main character decides he's going to kill her and take all of her money, and he's going to use the money to sort of like liberate himself, and he's going to do good things with it. So, spoiler alert, he does it. He does the crime. But then he's like racked with guilt with, what have I done? Was this the right thing to do? And so it is this like really deep, dark look at human nature and confronting, the reality of demons. So yes, it's a very famous story today. You can look more into it on your own. Anyways, I want to quickly move on here to talk about visual art. This is the era of Impressionism. Impressionism in visual art, you can see the paintings on the bottom. That would be on the bottom left. That is going to be an example of Impressionism. Impressionism gets its name from Claude Monet, who named one of his paintings Impression. And these are ideas about, or these paintings focus more on what the painter or the artist like is observing and feeling. It's not as much like, oh, I'm trying to imitate reality. Two famous people are Claude Monet, obviously, but also Berthe Morisot, who is a famous female painter of this era. You can click the link to learn more about her. Following the age of Impressionism, we see post-Impressionism. And so these are going to be paintings or works done by people like Cézanne, and so that will be the painting down here in the middle here, or Van Gogh. And so post-Impressionism is even like sort of further removed from the actual reality, and it is more about the sort of like feeling of it all, the feeling of the moment. And so what we're seeing in art, visual art, is really a shift away from an objective reality, something that we can all see and say, this is the way a tree looks, the sky is blue, the ocean is blue, the tree leaves are green, to a more subjective reality, how it appears or feels to a certain person. And so you can get a sense, like by looking at the Monet compared to the Cézanne, even the Monet, which is not perfectly accurate, seems more realistic than the Cézanne painting in the middle. And one of the reasons why Impressionism and Post-Impressionism are developing in this time is because the camera is being developed. The camera is being developed. Fun. The camera has literally been invented and photographs are being developed. And so when you have a camera that can literally take a photo of a real life thing, why would you paint reality? Why would you try and paint something perfectly realistic? Like, That's what cameras are for. So that really spurs on Impressionism and Post Impressionism because there's not as much of a need to duplicate reality now that cameras exist. Later on, this will also open the door for even more subjective pieces or styles of art, including Pablo Picasso's Cubism. My face is like right over this piece. Let me close it here. There it is. So this is an example of Cubism. Pablo Picasso um, uses, like in his art, he's painting a thing. In this particular picture or painting, it happens to be a person playing a guitar, but he's painting it from like a million different angles all at once. And so this is a really very, subjective reality for Picasso. Later on, we'll see the development of more like what we'd consider real modern art, such as abstract art. One of the most famous people here is Kandinsky. He's one of those people who paint stuff that you would see it in a museum and be like, I could do that. It's like his idea was like art shouldn't be like, it doesn't have to be a thing. It can just be something that evokes emotion. It's art for art's sake. So Kandinsky would do those paintings like really big where it's just like a giant splotch of red, like the whole canvas is red. And like, that's the painting. It's like, it's just red and the emotions that red evokes in you. And I think, to some extent, the conversation that evokes is this art, is painting a canvas red and putting it up. Is that art? Is the art the part where you're questioning and thinking about it, or is the art the thing that you can actually see? So really interesting ideas that, of course, then lead to even more, more abstract and weird types of art in the modern day. So that's that in terms of visual art. The last things I wanted to talk about were about music. In this era, we are seeing, because of a growth of nationalism, a renewed interest in folk music. Folk music is going to be like local music from ages ago of a certain region, and so this increasing nationalism, increases the development of folk music onto a larger stage. For instance, Edvard Grieg, who who composes this piece called the Peer Gynt Suite No. 1. You've definitely heard this, like in movies, or like it's just very out there. I think in culture, it's super famous. Listen to it on your own; you'll recognize it right away, I think. He develops music that is like has a very clear, like, this is Norwegian folk music, but it's being put onto a larger stage. It's not just being played at your local town hall or pub or whatever. This is music that's played in the symphony. Similarly, in Russia, we have the growth of Igor Stravinsky, who is a Russian composer who composes for the Ballet Russe, which is a ballet company that's coming out of Russia at this time. Particularly, he composes some very famous works, Firebird, The Rite of Spring, and Petrushka. These are all music that was for ballets, and the story in the ballets were all based on Russian fairy tales. So it's really, we can really see the growth of nationalism and things like this. I will say that Stravinsky's work is very different than what you might consider like, oh, this is nice music. It's a little cacophonous, meaning it's very like rah all at once. In fact, when his music was played for the first time, you had people in the theater or whatever who were like, this isn't music, and they got up and left, or they like rioted even in the theater because they just felt like it was so against what music should be. Anyways, that's that piece. So that's kind of my quick overview of some of the more abstract concepts of chapter 24. If you have any questions, obviously feel free to show up in office hours on Thursday before I see you again for our quiz and discussion on Friday. But yeah, that is it. Thanks for watching. Don't forget art history message board by the end of the day today. Finish up the chapter 24 mind map or outline. What am I missing? Study and do your discussion prep. So yeah, that's it for today. Thanks, and I look forward to seeing you again with my vaccinated arm on Friday. Have a good one.